and welcome to Question Christianity, where we talk about reasonable answers to tough questions. So tonight we are continuing our discussion about Paul Copan's "Is God a Moral Monster?" is the book we're kind of taking this from, but we're kind of taking the discussion and opening it up from the book. So if you have questions that come up related to this topic as we go through, please throw them in chat. We'd love to hear from people with questions, comments, all that good stuff. So I'm Caleb Johnston. With us tonight, first holding me up here, since we haven't had him for a few weeks, the one and only
Kevin Smith. Hi.
And leading our discussion tonight,
Charles Graves. Thank you. Reasonable Faith.
And the moral support of the evening.
Hi, I'm Pete. Yeah, I'm the cheerleader.
and a wonderful job you do at it too.
Ugly cheerleader.
I don't think you can say that. You shouldn't say that.
I only say that with love. Not that I'd make a better looking one either. Just looking at the beard going, man. Okay. Barbarisms, crude laws, and other imaginary crimes, punishments, and other harsh realities in perspective. So I wanted to start this out giving the whole idea of Old Testament laws, as we're really kind of getting nitty gritty here, with a conversation that I had with a family member a while back. And well, this is we were talking about homosexual practices and Christianity. She said basically that she said, I get that someone as devoted as you might be willing to be celibate under such conditions, but aren't you asking or assuming that others should and must take their religion as seriously as you do? So, which I sympathize with the point, but here's the problem with that. The problem with that is that it assumes individual autonomy, and that I am the king of me, and that if I want, I can choose the level of devotion that I give to the religion of my choice, if any. So if I choose to have any devotion to any religion, then the amount of that devotion, the amount of that religion is my autonomous choice. But the starting block is I'm autonomous. I don't belong to anyone. I belong to me, and I get to choose anything. And so if I want to have a certain amount of devotion, maybe I want to choose to be that devoted and be celibate, or maybe I don't. Maybe I'll just kind of mix it in a little bit. So, and this is really just back to the old ice cream fallacy, as it's been called, that religion is like a flavor of ice cream, and that you like perhaps ice cream flavors, or maybe you don't even like ice cream at all. But that's not the case. That's not reality, right? Reality is that we were created by God and for God, and we are not our own. We do not belong to ourselves. That's the starting point. And I know this may not seem very nice to some, but that doesn't mean it's not true. You are owned by the Creator. Whether you realize it or not, whether you acknowledge it or not, you are owned by the Creator. Non-Christians can continue to rebel. It's like, I don't expect non-Christians to act like Christians. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if you're a Christian, a Christian, by definition, is one who accepts Jesus Christ as Lord. And they do not have a say as to the level of devotion they would prefer to give. You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Do everything I command, said Christ. Or in Luke 17, which is actually, I really like Luke 17, verse 10, because it just kind of straightens me out and makes me remember that even when, well, this is the parable of the servant. And basically, when the servant comes in, he's like, do you expect the servant then to sit at the table? It's like, no. You continue, after you're done in the field, you come in and you continue to serve. You too, this is Jesus said, you too, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty. So that's the starting point. If you don't have that perspective, then any Old Testament laws are going to, at some level, rub against your sense of autonomy. And so I just kind of wanted to put that in perspective, and let's realize that God is actually the Lord of the universe, and he gets to make the laws. And what are your guys' thoughts about that?
Yeah, autonomy is the natural Western culture default, along with pragmatism. So religion is good if you want it to be and if it suits your needs, right? But as you said, that doesn't fit a theistic, much less a Christian worldview. So it depends on who you're talking to about this. It's good to settle that up front. If someone thinks they're neutral by assuming a personal autonomy view, what's the worldview basis for that? Well, naturalism would have to also be true. But if autonomy really is true, then we can't say anyone else's actions are wrong, and then we can't critique what we think are odd Old Testament laws and so forth and so on. There's really no ground to stand on if autonomy can be supported from a worldview. Then that same worldview won't be able to supply any critique of another one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good point. Caleb, any thoughts?
Yeah, just an analogy, and of course this is not perfect, but it always comes back to my mind in kind of this discussion. I think people often see religion very much like you said, like ice cream flavors, like a preference. And I think a better analogy that we should consider would be something more like a job. Again, it's not perfect, but in theory, I think if you're comparing it to something, I think it works out better from a mindset. You don't go into a job and think, I am going to do exactly what I want to do at this job, and I'm going to get paid for it. You listen to the boss. If you don't, you are not going to be at that job very long. So I think the analogy holds up better when we look at something like this, because really in making a decision for a worldview that has specific implications, it's more like a commitment to a job in some sense than it is to just going to the ice cream parlor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that job analogy. And I was just thinking, if we're not, I think there's not going to be a way that we're going to make an explanation here on this podcast that's going to satisfy every critic. That's just not going to happen. But I think what we can strive for is to show that at least that our religion is coherent, that within the confines, our religion and our God as, quote, a loving and just God is viable, that it can be defended from the scriptures. But to do that, as Kevin has shown out, you can't sacrifice part of our worldview and then use it to tear apart another when you're not being consistent in that. So all we're trying to say is, look at within this consistent worldview, if God is the creator, then he has the right to make laws and take lives where he sees fit. And I think it can be very well demonstrated that he is, in doing so, shown to be a just and loving God at the same time. What are your thoughts? Opening thoughts, Pete.
So one of the things you said there was and you were quoting the scripture where it says, you've been bought with a price. I heard a pastor one time who put this point on it. And he said, look, I'm not telling you that and he's specifically talking about homosexuality. He was talking about your sexual preference and your sexual behaviors. So I'm not telling you that the minute you become a Christian, that you're going to just magically change and never want to sin sexually again. He said, what I am telling you is that when you become a Christian and you make Christ, and not just your Savior, but also the Lord, the owner of your life, he said, when you do that, you make him owner of every area of your life. And you have to be obedient to that. So though it's not a popular thought process, I don't even look at it as a job. It is, and I don't mean this in the negative sense. I mean this in the sense that, again, you are owned. You are a slave to Christ. He's purchased you. He owns you through and through, and he does so for your benefit. And I know that slavery definitely carries a huge connotation, negative connotation. But in this case, you were purchased not for just humiliated servitude. You were purchased away from death and hell.
That's really important. I'm going to hit that again, but man, we really can't say that too much, that what we're talking about is the difference between eternal life and eternal death. All right, in the end. All right. Well, on that's a good point, Pete. The other thing that when you said that, it made me think of back when I was in the military. I remember being corrected one time by someone who said, look, you don't get to pick regulations you follow. You got to follow all of them. It's like, fair enough. So, all right. So in chapter, at the beginning of the chapter 9 here, I want to try to do as we normally do, which is steel man this a little bit and just acknowledge that at least on a surface or precursory reading, some of these Old Testament laws certainly seem archaic, certainly seem harsh, certainly seem barbaric in some aspects. So anyone want to maybe double tap that? Death? Here, some of the things we're talking about. It's like death penalty, lashes with 40 lashes, sometimes losing your life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Does that really fit our modern sensibilities?
If you curse your mother and father,
yeah, then what?
Then his blood guiltness is upon him. He'll be surely put to death.
All right. That seems pretty harsh. All right. Anyone else want to add some steel? No? Okay.
I like what you said up front, Charles, that there's no way we could, expect to explain every such law or statement in a way that's going to be satisfactory, even to us, right? Even to us.
Yeah, we're children of this culture,
right?
Like it or not.
It rubs the wrong way, and we don't want to, try to solve too much. In other words, be tempted to special pleading or. I was reading actually one review of Copan. It was a sympathetic review, but it warned us away from falling into what the reviewer called the press secretary syndrome. The press secretary's job is, you can never admit there's a problem. You always have to make everything look good, even if you actually don't think it's quite satisfactory. So we don't want to, we're not trying to come off that way. That's why we're doing this, for people who don't normally watch this. Steel manning, opposite of straw manning. So there are objections, opposing views, and we don't want to straw man the objections. We want to give them the credence, they deserve, and not claim that, too much for our abilities here, which are limited.
So what it sounds like what you're saying is maybe if I have a problem with the text, the problem might be with me.
That's certainly
could
true.
Be. Well, probably with me at least somehow, like I've misunderstood, or maybe just having been, as we said, born and raised in this culture.
Yeah, like I said, it's we're Westerners. This isn't a Western book, Middle Eastern book. First of all,
it's a book written by a bunch of the white patriarchy.
Not at all. No such.
Okay. All right. So he says here, Paul Copan says this: we shouldn't be surprised that there are parallels and overlaps between various ancient Near East laws and the Mosaic law. The same could be said about the Genesis account. There are certain similarities with the Genesis account that mirror. I don't have a problem with that at all. I don't think anyone should have a problem with that and go, oh my gosh, there's some similarities in these two ancient, or not two, but these, the other ancient Near East laws and the Mosaic law. Like, there's some similarities. Oh my gosh, we're horrified. It's automatically then a copycat religion. Not so. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised that there are similarities. Matter of fact, I think we have said this on virtually every podcast, but I'm going to say it again, because we really can't. This is another thing we need to stress over and over again if we're looking at the Old Testament laws. The Old Testament laws were not perfect, nor intended to be permanent. They state that themselves. They're self-stated. They're not intended to be permanent, and they're not perfect. Right? So they were temporary, and they're incremental. God, in a way, is meeting the people of that culture at that time halfway. Why doesn't he go all the way? Because what he wants is people to voluntarily take on these laws. If he made them too much like even if he made them like exactly what our current culture, God forbid, but if he did, like, there's no way that they would voluntarily follow that. It would be so strange, and to them, it's so anachronistic that there's no way that they would voluntarily follow laws like that. So he could force it on them, but then it wouldn't be voluntary. What he wants is people to voluntarily follow him. And in order to do that, he has to meet the culture where it is and at least get them an incremental step. So what's important is not what's copied, it's what's different. That's what's so critical, because when we compare it, sure, we can find similarities. Great, go find some similarities. What are the differences? What are the differences between the Mosaic law and the other ancient Near East laws? Those are flipping insanely important and crazy different. Like, to me, to me, and this is just personally, it seems miraculous in itself that this culture in that setting would go from all the laws that were currently in the culture and all of a sudden just make this gigantic leap toward value of human life. It's astounding to do it like that. And it comes to the snap of a finger. It comes instantly. It's like, here's your law. They themselves must be going, wow, this is the verge of where I can barely, it's like, okay, we can do this. This is really weird. Like, people are more important than oxes, even rich people's oxes. Like, that's weird. So
yeah, you've said two things. Incremental.
Yeah.
Reminds me, even Jesus said, I have more to tell you that you cannot yet bear.
So even we're not above that either.
Teaching is incremental, right? And then the culture, similarities versus differences. They are big. They're not entirely different, right? They're incremental, but the whole idea here is that God is calling a people out. You nice. Can't call a people out unless there's something to come out of. So they are coming progressively out of that based on this incremental call, which it comes in stages and steps. So the similarities have to be there if you're called out of something. The question is, what differences follow from the calling? And the differences, as you say, are stark, or at least noticeable. Yeah.
So I'm going to read this from the chapter. Again, various parallels. This is Paul Copan. Again, various parallels and similarities exist between ancient Near East laws and the Mosaic law, whether this be capital punishment for murder or legislation regarding a goring ox. And yes, there were certain humanizing improvements in various ancient Near East codes over time. For example, softening of legislation from the old Hittite laws to the new Hittite laws. But at key points, whopping differences exist between the Mosaic Law and other ancient Near East codes. The Sinai legislation presents genuinely remarkable, previously unheard of moral advances. Pete, thoughts?
Okay, sorry, just checking to see if my mic was on. Thinking about the differences that you would see among, you know, the Hebrew people as their laws were written. Yes, some cultural similarities, but the specific differences. It again makes me look at kind of like what Kevin said, being called out of something, and like we said last week or last time we broadcast, that there was a specific differentiator that here I'm calling you to be holy, and that holiness had all right. So looking forward to the cross, that holiness had a punitive aspect. Looking forward to the cross, that penalty needed to be not only delineated, but severe.
And let's also remember that they agreed to this law. So it wasn't pressed upon them without agreement. Remember, it was voluntary. All this we will do. They at Mount Sinai, they swore a blood covenant to obey this law, and every generation at their bar mitzvah would either adopt or reject this law as their own. So it was voluntary all the way through. If you didn't like it, you could leave. I mean, somewhat harsh, but it's like, hey, are you in or out? Like, if you're in, then here it is. If not, then don't be part of Israel. But it was voluntary. I can't remember who said it, but it was Ravi Zacharias. He's just got a lot of one-liners, man. For whatever else might be said, man. But he was talking about sometimes you'll have people compare or say that Christianity and other religions, they're all basically the same. They all focus on love, and they all, love God, love your neighbor, and the greatest commandment, and, the golden rule. They're all basically the same. It's like, there's some similarities, but almost always the differences are more important than the similarities. So, for example, you could have two white pills, right? They're both small, both bitter, both about the same size, same weight. One's aspirin, one's cyanide. A lot of similarities. Differences, critical.
Now, here's an example I think you'll appreciate, Charles. I mean, you can have, for example, an organization, a group of organized people who've obtained weaponry and who've got behind an ideology and march into other countries and enforce their ideology on other people. Now, you could have that with a terrorist organization. You could have that with a military. And regardless of all the other differences that are there, it's drastic. The comparison between the two, the reasons behind it, the organization behind it, all those things are starkly different. Even if you have all these on the face similarities, in kind of, if you were to break down just a basic description, it's just a mischaracterization to put the two on the same level.
Yeah, to just compare the similarities and ignore the differences is not to be rational. You've got motivation there. You're trying to achieve something that's beyond rationality at that point. All right, that's good points. All right, let's talk about some specifics. Sabbath breakers and slanders. All right, from the book. He references Numbers 15:32 through 36, if any of our listeners want to go check it out. This is the stick gathering Sabbath breaker. And so he's out gathering sticks on the Sabbath. And the stick gathering Sabbath breaker illustrates a defiant act. It's a direct violation of God's clear command in Exodus 31:35. The one working on the Sabbath was to be put to death. Then we have the son who blasphemes the slander God or the name as well as the stubborn religious son. These are these two, I think you misspelled two there. It's T-O-O, that's weird. These two are flagrant violations of, two, okay, it is right. These also are flagrant violations of what God had commanded. Okay, fine. Often when first-time violations, so here's his explanation. Often when first-time violations were committed in the midst of this fledgling nation, a harsh punishment came with it. So sometimes, and if we got kids, we all understand this. As soon as you lay a rule, man, you can just guarantee someone's going to test that. And if you don't enforce it, it's not a rule. It's not a rule, right? Yeah. As I once heard, it's not the rules you make, it's the ones you enforce. Okay.
Yeah.
Because man, that's so weird. I mean, even in this country, we got laws that say you can't come here illegally, and then you can, and then you get, it's like, it's only if you enforce. It doesn't matter what's on the books. It's only what's chosen to be enforced. Mm-hmm. All right. So what might we say about, because I mean, there's a lot of this. There's Nahab and Abihu, who another golden calf incident. There's Uzziah, who tries to study the ark when they haven't seen the ark in a while. It's like, okay, the ark's coming back. There's Ananias and Sapphira in the New Testament. Of course, we all know that the New Testament God is a much nicer, kinder, gentler God than the Old Testament God. But there he is, there they are, Ananias and Sapphira struck dead. New period, new enforcement, justified?
So I want to touch on something you just said. It's not the laws you write, or the rules you write, it's the ones you enforce. And then we kind of made some allusions to the way the governments write laws, but then don't enforce them from time to time. And we could make some, and this is not to be political. I'm going to touch a political point, and then I want to back away from it and then speak to the laws that God enforced, and that he enforced every law, and that, again, there was a penalty for any law broken. If you look at political laws that are written but not enforced, or a law that was written in a previous administration or 2, 3, 10 administrations back that's no longer enforced, one might look at it and even make the, I don't know if the word accusation is the right word, or at least the assertion that maybe there's an agenda for whatever the upcoming or the administration or the lawmakers in either that jurisdiction or in that nation or what have you. Now let's go back to the laws that God created and the enforcement. What was his agenda? His agenda was to assert his own holiness. And it never changed. That's a great point,
by the way.
Not once. Great point. Now, if we look, and we've looked in throughout the book of Luke, we've looked at various places where the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, were the enforcers of God's law, and they came at it with an agenda. So frequently we could see the agenda of man overshadowing and almost papier-mâchéing over top of God's law, which was ultimately to glorify God and his holiness. But when we grab a hold of it and then we start shaping it to us, we ignore certain laws, we stiffen up on other laws. Hey, you're working on the Sabbath, doggone it, and you picked up your bed and walked. Mm-hmm. What's the agenda? And I kind of can, maybe I could be a little bit sympathetic to people when they hear Christians and particularly church people talk about the laws of the Bible, and maybe a little suspicious of what's your agenda.
I think that, man, touching on the holiness of God, I think, is not just a great point. I think it's the point. We're not talking about the flying spaghetti monster. We're not talking about Sky Daddy. We're talking about the thrice holy God who created the universe and condescended to rescue us. And how many times in the Old Testament laws do you say, like, here's the law, here's the law, here's the law. I am holy. Like, I am holy. You're not just doing this because I'm some arbitrary God who says you can't work on one day a week. So I am holy. I know what's good for you because I'm actually God. You're not going to work on Sunday. Do what you're told, or you're in high treason. It's like, okay, you're either going to follow that or you're going to deny the holiness of God, right? That's the point.
The treason, I think, actually shows up in this Sabbath breaker in Numbers 15. To gather sticks isn't something you do secretly, privately. Can only be done, presumably, out in public.
Mm-hmm.
So here's someone who brazenly, in front of the whole covenant people, takes it upon himself to
what's
do
the
what
point
no
there?
one else can do.
So, okay, I know that I swore that I would obey this law and that blood would sprinkle on me, and I said all this I will do, and now it's Sunday. But you know what? Gosh, I didn't even think about this, but how arbitrary. Like, you're going to disobey this law that you made a blood oath to uphold to go gather sticks? Like, that's worth it to you? I mean, I've got this thing, just whatever it is. I heard a while back, like, this is just personal, I'm not trying to make any over morally statement, but if you see a quarter on the street, don't pick it up. It's not yours. Like, and that made sense to me. It's like, it's not mine. Maybe someone's going to come back for it. Probably not, but I'm not going to do it. But more importantly, it's like, but that's the standard I set up for myself. Like, I'm just not going to pick up a quarter on the street. Now there are times where I've been tempted, but it's like, you know what? I'm not going to violate my morality for 25 cents. It's like, not worth it for that. I'm not saying that should be a moral thing. I'm just saying, for me it is, and for 25 cents, I'm not violating it. And I can't tell you how many times it's like, but it's just a penny. It's like all the worse that I'm going to violate it for just a penny, a shiny penny. I'm going to violate the morality that I said, this is my standard, I'm sticking to it. I'm not going to violate that for a dime. Are you kidding me? It's like, so the higher it is, the more it's got, but the lesser it is, it's actually makes it even kind of worse. That's what strikes me. Like, for sticks, you're going to go violate the 10 commandments for sticks? Man, that's like a middle finger, I think. All right, let's hit it the other way. There's two other options. One is that he still had the same commandment, and that he didn't enforce it, at least yet. So what would be the outcome? What is a likely outcome if God hadn't enforced the law?
More people are going to violate it.
Okay, and if there's no follow through, then what?
They abandon their God. Why not?
There's
Why not?
He's
He's
no
not
law.
doing anything about his laws.
There's no law. There's no law. It's like, what kind of God are you? Won't even, like, whatever the laws are, whether you like them or not, if they're not upheld, then they're not laws. That goes back to our point before. So if he's not gonna enforce them, now could there have been a lighter sentence? Perhaps. But I think we go back to, like, Kevin's point. It's like, man, this is a little bit more than just getting slapped on your palm for this. This is a blood oath. Like, that's something in itself. It wasn't just like, I promise. It's like, no, it's a blood oath. You entered it. By your life, you said you would follow it, and you blew it for sticks. I, the Lord, am holy. Keep the Sabbath holy. All right, so maybe then, so one option is he doesn't enforce it. The other one is, and this, man, if you really want to be a screwed up parent, here's what you do. Sometimes enforce your laws. Just arbitrarily. Like, make a law and then just, like, flip a coin whether or not you're going to enforce it.
Now, I think we should distinguish between arbitrary and deliberate mercy.
Oh,
how would
sure.
you distinguish that? Just because I can imagine some objections here. What do you mean by an arbitrary parent?
Well, I don't want to say I'm speaking autobiographically, but sure I am, because I think every parent fails at this, including me. I've done this before, where it's like, you let your kids get away with something, and then all of a sudden you're like, I've had it, and then you flip it, and then you over enforce it. You're like, how many times have I told you? But you weren't enforcing it. You didn't enforce it like the last 10 times, and all of a sudden you're just sick of it. You realize you haven't enforced it for 10 times, so you bring like 10 times wrath onto this one thing. There's no mercy. It's just laziness and then rage.
You must have been watching me parent.
Especially just ignoring something in order to not deal with it. Again, autobiography.
Yeah. Not good, right? Not good parenting.
You're not even like calling them on it. You're just like ignoring it.
Yeah,
you just deal with it.
Maybe they'll start to follow. If I ignore it, maybe they'll just start to obey.
Yeah, that's how it's worked out. Right.
There's also two other points that I think need to be stated. They're kind of like, these are like sidecar points. They just kind of travel along with. Number one, arbitrary, enforcement. I think the number one is that for God to enforce His law, or to fail to enforce His law, or to fail to demand that it be enforced, is basically a strike. Him striking Himself. Basically, I'm going to create a law, and then not holding that law as absolute is ultimately saying His own holiness is in question. That would be point number one. Point number two that I think I would add alongside of that is that we as people have shown to be very intense about how we want to enforce God's law. A, we're selective, and B, we like catching people in the wrong.
Yeah.
And holding them to the law that I broke it too, but you broke it, and I can make a showboat out of you and cast you in front of a bunch of people. I mean, while I know that many of the early manuscripts don't record the woman caught in adultery, nonetheless, if that is an accurate thing to be included in Scripture, it kind of just is a good example of how the Sanhedrin behaved towards sinners. If I can find somebody that I can show as a flagrant sinner and I can shine the spotlight on them, all the better, because it keeps my sin in the shadows. And the ultimate point is that the mercy of God is most often experienced when we place our own sin in the spotlight of Christ.
All right, so from the book, Ananias and Sapphira in the New Testament Acts, who were struck dead for lying about just how generously they were. The message was not lost on the early church. This quote from the scripture, great fear came over the whole church and over all who heard of these things. Especially in exemplary or first-time cases, God seems especially heavy-handed. God isn't to be trifled with. God isn't to be trifled with. He takes sin seriously, and He is often setting a precedent with first-time offenses. For the people of God, these punishments were to be sobering reminders of what God expected. And I would add to that, and what they agreed to do. Final thoughts on that section? Did we miss something? All right. The glutton and the drunkard from Deuteronomy 21, 18 through 21. So, what about this harsh text quoted earlier? Let's see if we can find it. Deuteronomy 21, 18 through 21. If any man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father or his mother, and when they chastise him, he will not even listen to them, for his father and mother shall seize him and bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate of his hometown. They shall say to the elders of the city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death. So you shall remove the evil from your midst, and all Israel will hear of it and fear.
Raise your hand if you're glad you didn't live back then.
Yes and no, man. I certainly wouldn't want to live back then and be a glutton and a drunkard. But if you knew that's what the standard was, there'd be a lot less drunkards and gluttons running around town. And so you have an orderly society. And again, this was temporary and not ideal. We just want to hammer that again. So yeah, I mean, maybe there's a point in not living back then because they had a temporary and imperfect law.
I'll drink to
still.
that.
Okay, so what about that harsh text? We're stoning kids at the city gate. Here's what. Yeah, go ahead.
Kevin, maybe you would be great to speak to this. When it talks about children, particularly in the Old Testament, what are the age ranges there?
Well, what struck me about this passage was this kid is old enough to be a glutton and a drunkard. And he's been for a long time disciplined. So this isn't what I would call a kid. I don't know what the age is, but of course, also remember that in Israelite society, a young man is a young man, younger than what we would call a man, with rights and responsibilities that go along with that, in the teen years. So I don't see this as, somebody's 11-year-old running around, sticking his tongue out at mommy, and so we're going to execute him. Mm-hmm. Somebody old enough to be a drunkard. Mm-hmm. It didn't say someone who got drunk. A drunkard, which is a characteristic way of life. I'm not even sure that this is a minor, because young men lived with their parents into adulthood until they married, right? And then often even beyond that.
Yep, correct.
So, that's not to cover all other possibly similar passages, but that really stands out to me in this particular passage.
To that point, I mean, if you're dealing with someone who is like, say, an 11-year-old, you can just literally overpower them. I mean, if you're an adult, you can, grab them by the scruff of their neck, take the bottle out of their hand, take the whatever it is, or spank them, whatever. There's certainly intermediate measures. What about when that son, though, grows up and he's adult and you can't physically restrain him?
Right, which is this text begins with they're already limited to their voice. They have disciplined him. But now the problem is he won't listen to their voice. Not just to the father, by the way, but the mother. Mother is given authority.
Yeah,
female here in the house.
The parents.
We'll come back to later. Female. So again, there's not much. I can't see anything in this text that suggests it's a minor, much less what we would call a child.
Here's what Paul says. We're not talking about a little practical joker or even about a teenager who won't clean up his room. He's an utter delinquent whose hardened, insubordinate behavior simply can't be corrected, despite everyone's best effort. He's a repeat offender. When they, and this is a quote, when they, his father and his mother, chastise him, he will not even listen to them. So, as you said, it's like they've tried and tried and tried. They won't listen. He's a picture of insubordination, a glutton and a drunkard. Now, we also have to remember, it's so hard for us to get out of our Western current cultural minds. There was a responsibility for the child to take care of the family and to take care of the land. The land was a big deal back then. So, again, this was a serious problem, would have had a profoundly destructive effect on the family and the wider community. And then in parentheses, Jesus was called a glutton and a drunkard. That was no small insult. Basically, they're saying, hey, you're a glutton and a drunkard. Like, we should take you to the gate and stone you. Anyway, so it's a very serious offense.
I don't think it's any accident that we see this same thing paralleled in the prodigal son. I think we also have to look at that comparison, and even just that picture gives you a great idea of God's progressive mercy.
Exactly. Temporary and incomplete. This son, again from the text, this son, probably a firstborn, would inevitably squander his inheritance when his father died. He would likely bring ruin on his present and future family. Now, here's what's interesting about this. See, this tends to be straw man. It's like, hey, if your son's acting out, then you're going to take him to the gate and start throwing rocks until he dies. That's not what it says. Who throws the rocks here? Who determines that the rocks are even going to be thrown? Is it the parents?
It's a communal decision.
Okay, so it says he was. Let's see. Notice though that the parents don't take matters into their own hands. That's really important, right? This isn't just an arbitrary choice at the parents. The parents have the right to say, "Look, we've tried everything. He won't listen to us. Where are we going to go? Let's go to the civil authorities, who are responsible for keeping an orderly, functioning society." The parents are not even in the picture any longer.
It's
They're out of it.
It's a covenant people, right?
Yep. The parents aren't in the picture any longer. They're not taking charge of the punishment. Rather, the community carries out this exercise of social responsibility. I like that. Social responsibility. Again, this is I like that. It's a community. It's like if you got someone in the community, well, they can either leave or they can, I mean, what are you going to do? So, and when it takes this drastic action, is a tragic last resort to deal with the trouble. So certainly, I think we could believe that there were parents who brought their kids to the civil authorities. The civil authorities said, "Look, he's bad. He's not that bad, right? It's not. We're not going to kill him. I mean, I think you guys are overreacting. Like that's why you have these mediators there." Anything else? We got any questions? We're getting close to our time. I'm wondering, should we do one more section?
Sure.
All right. Mediums, sorcerers, and false prophets. Man, of all the ones I don't have a problem with, and again, not that I should have a problem, but man, this one I just don't have a problem with this one. I don't have. Mediums or diviners and sorcerers, soothsayers were prohibited from living in Israel on pain of death. So, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, someone who's directly challenging the very basis of the covenant people, and that is who God is, and what is God, how do we approach him. Someone who's deliberately set themselves up against the whole theology of the people, of our relationship to God and how that occurs. This couldn't be more subversive.
Yeah, and subversive against what? See, we need to remember what the cost is here. From Paul. In a democratic society like ours, all of this sounds intolerant. We're to respect the freedom of religion of others, aren't we? And I would say yes. Again, we're talking about temporary and not ideal. So I'm not advocating for this now, but I'm certainly sympathetic with what it was accomplishing back then. You got one nation, God's chosen people. This is God's holy people. Who had agreed to keep these laws holy, and you have someone else who's coming in here and trying to derail the whole thing. What is the cost? I'm going to read from Paul. In a democratic society, we're to respect the freedom of religion. Yes, in this society we are. Yet Israel had bound herself voluntary to Yahweh, who had made a covenant with Israel, like a husband to a wife. The people of Israel themselves had vowed that they were God's and that they would keep his covenant. They had willingly submitted to God's theocratic rule. And I just want to remind everyone, we're not talking about ice cream here. We're talking about the difference between heaven and eternal suffering in hell forever.
So,
right? To bring it, just to emphasize it, to bring in another religious person who's trying to lead the people astray is to allow them to lead people into damnation forever. It's not a small thing.
One of the things that kind of hit me is that, again, talking about the progressive nature and the incompleteness of, and the not as, what's the phrase that we, to get to the point of, if we were to permit if God were to permit mediums and sorcerers and those sorts of things, which kind of had a signs and wonders and a voice from beyond, voice from a higher power, voice possibly a replacement voice of God, God's ultimately trying to protect there being a singular voice that gives them direction. And if we look at the way that Saul, the king of Israel, the first king of Israel, when he approached a medium to 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 get direction, and yet Samuel's over here saying, "You're well." Granted, at that point in time, Samuel was dead, but beforehand, Samuel was saying, "You have someone who's trying to give you directions. God Himself is trying to give you directions, and you're just not obeying them. And now you're going to go seek out a secondary source." And I think if we look back at that time period, one of the reasons why I think that would have been a very important law to not just have on the books, but to enforce with a level of severity, is to keep the message singular, keep the source singular. Thoughts on that?
Well, it's probably not a great metaphor, but the Israelites were God's children, and we're talking about a practice that leads them into destruction. And for me, I don't know if it's the best metaphor, but I'm thinking about, like, I'm a parent and I've got these kids that I love. I'm trying to raise them up in the right way, and this pedophile comes around and he's trying to lead them into this just disgusting practice. Like, really, it's probably worse. It's what they're doing is probably worse, because not that pedophilia is great, but eternal damnation in hell is a pretty darn bad thing, right? And it's a very serious thing. It's incredibly serious. You know, that we're not talking about ice cream. This is the reality. We're talking about literal heaven and hell. We're talking about the plan of salvation that's supposed to come through Israel, like Christ comes through Israel. If the nation disappears because they just fragment into all these various religions, it goes away. Like, God is not going to let that happen. It's a very serious thing.
You know, I want to jump in right there too, because I think this is, at this point in the conversation, it's often taken very much kind of full circle the other way. So when you look at this and see mediums and false prophets and all these people condemned, from a modern sense, you think of it as, okay, these people weren't legit. They were just false prophets. Therefore, they shouldn't have been killed for this. So it's really just a fear of outsiders is how this is often phrased. It's a fear of outside groups, because we've got this culture, and anything outside of it is bad. But I think it's really important to look closely at the text, because that's not what you get from the Bible. Specifically in the same chapter in Leviticus 19, where it deals strongly with a number of laws, there's also a passage in chapter 33 that says, "And if a stranger sojourn with thee in your land, ye shall not do him wrong. The stranger that sojourneth with you shall be unto you as homeborn among you, and thou shalt love him as thyself. For ye were sojourners in the land of Egypt. I am Jehovah your God." So I think it's important to make that distinction here. We're not just dealing with outsiders. Outsiders are to be treated very much as brothers within this until they violate the laws. They're held to the same standards if they come in to this community.
And that's remarkable in itself, by the way.
Right.
Yeah, back to the idea that they're called out of something. One of the things they're called out of is this occult religious A&E culture, ancient Near Eastern culture. And this is precisely an example of the new direction of holiness away from these occultic practices, which are indeed
they're indeed something. All right. Even so, it's misleading for Sam Harris to speak of stoning to death a son or daughter for coming home from a yoga class. That's a straw man if I ever heard one. The point of Deuteronomy 13:6-16 is that of a false teacher he tries to entice the community by commanding worship to other deities. Let us go and serve other gods. That's not a yoga class. Of course, those not wanting to embrace Israel's God or obey his requirements were free to leave. Just go, right? Just don't do that crap in my house, right? Not with my kids. You're not doing that here.
Right.
Yeah. All right.
We do have a question that's come in. On what basis do you, or the author, determine that these laws are temporary and not ideal? We did cover this a lot about 3 or 4 episodes back when we kind of did introduction to a lot of this. So if you want the full discussion, go there. Charles, you want to give us the 30-second version?
So Jeremiah 31:31, there's coming a time when I will make a new law, a new covenant, and I will write their law on their hearts instead of on tablets of stone or something like that. It's not perfect, but it's close. There's another one, Ezekiel. I think in Ezekiel, and I can't remember the explicit verse, but a Google search would probably be able to find it. But it's something again about like hearts of flesh instead of hearts of stone or something like that. You got that one a little bit better, Caleb? Okay.
I will replace their hearts of stone with hearts of flesh, something along those lines. Yeah.
Right. And that's in the Old Testament. And so that's in the Old Testament, and it's basically saying, look, there's coming a time where I'm going to make a new covenant. Like there's an acknowledgement in the Old Testament where this is temporary. Like it's pretty explicit. There's coming a time when this one's going away and a new one's coming, and it's better because it's going to be on their heart. Like I'm going to circumcise their heart. Like they're going to want to follow, right? Because why? Because they're going to be filled with the Holy Spirit, and they'll be redeemed, and they'll desire not perfectly, but more and more perfectly, better and better, right? By help of the Holy Spirit and sanctification. So, Kevin's back. Where in the Old Testament can we say that it self-describes as temporary? And what's the question? Put it back up there. On what basis do you, or the author, determine that these laws are temporary and not ideal?
I see you have Jeremiah 31. Ezekiel 36 is the other chapter.
26.
And then for an example, for Christians to see the fulfillment of that, just look at how Jesus goes through the law in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5-7. You have heard it said.
Yeah, great point.
It's not a rejection of, but a fulfillment of these increments that God had established through the Mosaic law, period. So it's already built in with some hints to begin with, but during the period of Israel forming, right, this has to be solidified and enforced.
Okay, I think that's probably more than the 30-second version. I'm not trying to shy away from it, but we do cover that pretty in depth in it's one of the earliest ones, one of the earlier podcasts. So certainly there's more answers there, and better than us is to pick up Paul Copan's book and get him to describe it for you, or maybe some other authors. Okay, good question though. I think I'm going to respect our time. That's an hour. Closing quotes from maybe each one of you. Who wants to go first?
All right. Well, if I'm just going to say that if you're not subscribed, you need to click that subscribe button.
Please do.
And thumbs up, thumbs down, doesn't matter which. That's it.
Right. That
if you enjoy this content.
It's a covenant between us that
right.
There we go. Make content for you. You got a closing comment, Kevin?
I would say keep the big picture in mind. Depending on where you're coming from, don't get confused about what type of objection needs to be answered. In other words, if you're not a Christian, you're not a believer, your objection is probably either, look, biblical Christianity is inconsistent with itself. There's an internal consistency problem, or you might charge that it fails to live up to moral standards that it ought to. I think in the second case, you have a bigger problem of showing what the basis of moral problems is, apart from some transcendent principle or standard. But in the first case, internal consistency, I think we can show a great deal of consistency once you understand what the narrative is that's supposed to be consistent. And that is that there was an ideal paradise, there was a fall from that. So in bringing things back around, by definition, you're not in the ideal state, but incrementally progressing toward a redemption, a restoration, ultimately. Keeping that narrative in mind, you see that a lot more of it makes sense, even though we're definitely going to fail in seeing, all the bits and pieces of that.
Good. And our cheerleader?
To that point, I think I would say two things. Number one, the disagreements that people have with Scripture, and Kevin covered this a little earlier, is that a lot of times we have disagreements with the cultural. Hey, puppy. We have disagreements with the culture, with things that are not culturally similar to us. We're trying to judge the ancient Near East culture in relationship to the way we would do things and the way our current culture operates. And that's not you're trying to judge. It's not even apples and oranges. It's apples and bricks. I mean, you're just really, you have such dissimilarities that you're not able to judge carefully. And I think the second part is the progressive nature of this law, the progressive nature of this holiness. It doesn't actually go in our favor for the most part. If you look at the older law, it's actually, a little bit easier to keep. So long as I don't do any of these things, then I'm okay. But I think one of the things that Christ brought to bear, again, in the Sermon on the Mount and the other places where he's addressing the law, you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. I tell you, if you look at a woman lustfully, he raises the bar and basically makes it even all the more unattainable. There are plenty of people who've never killed a person, never done, at least in Judaic custom, they thought they were holy. And then all of a sudden Jesus is laying the bar saying, you aren't. And not only are you not holy, you're so unholy, I'm going to have to take the punishment for you. An infinitely holy God is going to have to take the punishment because you are so infinitely unholy.
Yeah. My quick final thoughts is if you want to find straw man arguments against the Old Testament, you can surely find them. You'll find what you're looking for. If you want truth and you're genuinely looking for truth and you're willing to at least hear challenges to your own assumptions, but you're willing and looking for truth, you'll find it. I think you'll find it there. So we're trying to help you on that road if you're looking for it. If you're not looking for it, we're not going to help you at all. You're just going to be like spitting at the monitor. And we certainly had some comments that seem to mirror that. But yeah, if you're looking for the truth, I think you'll find it. Caleb?
That's it. I think we're good for tonight. So hope you enjoyed the show. If you liked it, please drop us a line. Let us know.
Tell us if you liked. This is Tukey. Say hi to Tukey in the comments.
That's not
Tukey. And that's going to be our highest ratings ever.
Like and subscribe.
All right. Good night, everybody.